Good morning. Hope you're all doing well. We are up to Yud Tes Amud Aleph 19.8 Nan Hasam. We learned in a Mishnah elsewhere. Okay, so this is going to be a tangent of sorts. And the Mishnah said, "Al Nachach Nimtzeis Babasar." Rabbi Chanina Skana Kohanim testified. Rabbi Chanina Skana Kohanim was the person who kicked off our entire discussion over here. He's the author of the Tana of the Mishnah that started this whole discussion about Tuma and Tara. And he testified also about Shasakin Vayadayim Tahoros, that about a needle that was found in the flesh of a slaughtered offering. Okay, and so there is an animal that is being brought as a korban, and the korban is shechted, is slaughtered, and when they're slaughtering, after they slaughter it, they find a needle, and we're gonna have to come back to explain why we assume this needle is tameh, because why should we? But we'll come back to that. And the Rabbi Chanina Skana Kohanim testifies that the halacha was that the knife which cut this animal and the hands which handled the animal and the knife, they are all tahar, they are pure, basar, but the flesh which came into contact with the needle is tameh. Okay, nimtzeis baperish. However, if the needle was discovered in the animal's excrement, then hakol tar, everything, including the flesh, is going to be tar. Okay, says Rabbi Kiva. I'm Rabbi Kiva. That's the end of the statement of Rabbi Chanina Skana Kohanim. Rabbi Kiva now comments on Rabbi Chanina Skana Kohanim. Zachinu she'en tumas adam b'mikdash. We are fortunate there is no rabbinically decreed tuma upon hands in the temple. So what he means by that is as follows: there is a general decree that hands, because they are busy, so to speak, because the fact that they touch things, we're not always aware of what our hands are touching. Chazal, our sages, that came along and they said that all hands are treated like a sheni l'tuma, second degree tuma. And the reason they did this was because they were concerned that people are going to have dirty hands, repulsive hands. They're going to go ahead and touch kachim, they're going to go ahead and touch truma, they're going to go ahead and touch holy things, and they're going to make the food repulsive. People are not going to eat it, and these are holy things which are supposed to be eaten, not supposed to be wasted. And therefore, to prevent that, what they did was they mandated, they created a reality where all hands are going to be a second degree of tuma, and therefore necessitating some form of washing, and that is actually the original netilas yadayim that we do before bread. That is ultimately based on this, and therefore we have to wash our hands in this fashion that cleans the hands, also from a hygienic perspective, but also from a Tumah and Tara perspective. A fascinating institution to ensure cleanliness, hygiene by Chazal. One way or another, Rabbi Kiva points out like this: the fact that in this case you have a pin, you have a needle which is tameh, which we're treating as tameh, and you have the hands which come into contact with it. The fact that the hands are not going to be tameh, they're treated as tar, according to Rabbi Chanina Skana Kohanim, that teaches us that the fact that again, and over here we're dealing with a case where there is a suffix, there's a potential over here that there should be tumah, which is going to transfer from the needle to the hands, which ultimately touch the knife and the flesh and all that. But the fact that we don't treat it as tameh teaches us that in general it must be that we are lenient about rabbinically decreed tumah of the hands in the area of the Beis Hamikdash. And therefore Rabbi Kiva concludes that when it comes to hand tumah, which we normally have everywhere else, it does not apply on the Temple Mount. Ask the Gemara, v'neima she'ein tumas yadayim v'chelim b'mikdash. Why is Rabbi Kiva only focusing on the hands? If you recall, Rabbi Chanina Skana Kohanim said that both the hands and the knife are tahar. So Rabbi Kiva should say that there is no rabbinically decreed tumah upon hands or utensils in the Beis Hamikdash. So Rabbi Yehuda Marav, Yitim Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Chanina. So we have an answer from one of these two Amoraim. Yadayim kodem gzera kelim sheninu nishnu. He says that the reason that he only mentions utensils is because, really, again, let's review for a second. Utensils cannot make other utensils tameh midoraisa. Rabbinically, that could happen. Now, that is all based on decrees. So these Amoraim are suggesting that the decree about hands being able to be tameh actually preceded the decree of utensils being able to make other utensils tameh, and therefore when Rabbi Chanina Skana Kohanim was talking, it was a point where only hands were considered tameh and utensils were not considered tameh, and that's why he's only talking about hands, because he's talking about in a scenario, in a era where it's before the decree on utensils being able to be matame other utensils. The Gemara says that's not true. Amarava, they're actually decreed on the same day, and this Mishnah should sound familiar to you for all those who learn Shabbos. It's not. We learned in a Mishnah quoted in the beginning of Masechah Shabbos, HaSefer, a holy scroll, a Sefer of Tanakh is actually going to be treated as tameh. Why is it treated tameh? Because what people used to do is they used to have, keep in mind, they didn't have fridges, cupboards, etc. So they used to store things in random places, and sometimes a person would have things which are holy, like truma. And so you want to make sure that it doesn't get mixed up with other things. So what would they do? They would put the truma, they would put sanctified things together they would store it in like a Sefer of Tanakh. They'd put it at the scroll to remind themselves that this is holy stuff. The problem was that food attracts mice, and the mice would go ahead and nibble away at the scrolls, and therefore Chazal came along and said that scrolls are actually considered tameh. Touching the scrolls is considered tameh, and therefore people would not put the holy food together, the food vayadayim and unrinsed hands, which is what we're talking about. Veha tvul yom, and someone who is a tvul yom. Again, tvul yom is someone who immersed, but the 7 days, the requisite time they have to wait is not over yet. So they immersed not after the 7 days, but during the 7 days, like on the last day. And food or utensils that came tame from coming into contact with other beverages, they are all part of the 18 enactments. Remember, there was like these 18 decrees that were discussed in Masech Shabbos, so they are part of that list. And that is in that list you see hands and you see talim. So you see it's actually at the same time. You tried to answer Rabbi Yehuda Marav and Rabbi Yossi Bar Chanina wanted to answer that the decree for hands actually preceded the decree for utensils. You see from this Mishnah that they're actually all decreed on the same time. Rava says like this: no, the reason that Rekiva doesn't emphasize the tuma of the knife and saying, oh look, there is no decree about utensils causing other utensils to become tamei in the base of Mikdash, because it wouldn't have even been tamei by chulin. Why? Meaning by non-sacred items. Why? Because what did this knife ultimately come into contact with? If you want to say it came into contact with the flesh that was tame through the needle, we know that food cannot contaminate a utensil, like we spoke about earlier. Do you want to say that it came into contact with the needle itself? And a utensil is not able to contaminate a utensil. So Rabbi Kiva comes along and says, wow, in the base of Mikdash, there's no tumah of the hands. That is a novel point, because outside the base of Mikdash, there is a tumah of hands. But when it comes to a utensil, causing another utensil to become tamei, that's something, the knife over here would not be tamei no matter what. And therefore, there's no need to emphasize that part of the halacha, because that is not novel to the idea of kachim. That's something which is simply the halacha. Okay, fine. Now the Gemara says further, Hai machat 19b2. Hai machat mai avite. What is the nature of this flesh? Why are we assuming this needle is tame? So if you want to say it's a case where you don't know where it came from, you don't know if it was tame, you don't know if it was tahara, and therefore it's rabbinically prohibited. Rabbinically, we're going to treat it as tame. Okay, so we had a teaching by both Rav Elazar and Rav Yossi, the son of Chanina. We didn't know who said what, but one of them said that there is no presumption of tumah on unidentified saliva in Yerushalayim. Come back to what that means in a moment. The other one said that we don't oppose in a situation of a suffix of tumah on unidentified utensils, we don't treat it as tamei. The bottom line is then that, and we'll come back and analyze this in a moment, but the point is that you see that utensils like this needle, which you don't know what its source is, we do not. So normally, you're right, we would treat it as tamei, but in Yerushalayim, we do not treat it as tamei. So this needle that we've been treating as tamei, right? Again, the case of the case person slaughters a animal, and in the animal there is a needle, which we're saying we're going to treat as tamei. Why are we treating it as tamei? It's in Yerushalayim, obviously, and therefore we should treat it as tahar. So Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Avin Amar, Kigon Shaisa Parachamusa Ava Michutz Yerushalayim. We're talking about a case where the cow that was used as an offering was muzzled from the second it walked into Yerushalayim. So we therefore have to assume the needle came from outside Yerushalayim, and therefore, yeah, it's going to be a tamei needle. Okay, now we go back to this idea of the saliva. Gufa. Okay, so one said we didn't make a decree about unidentified saliva found in Yerushalayim. The other one said we don't make a decree of tuma on unidentified utensils that are found in Yerushalayim. Rukin Tanina, Kelim Tanina. The Gemara asks, both these things were already taught elsewhere. Rukin Tanina, for example, the spit, the unidentified saliva was taught. It's not called Rukin Tzam Yerushalayim Tahorin. All saliva is found in Yerushalayim is presumed to be tahar, pure, chutz mishel shuk ha'elyon, except for that's found in the upper marketplace. So what's going on with this? This spit. So the idea is like this: a person who is a certain types of tuma, a person in a situation where a person has certain types of tuma, when they spit, it's not only if they come into contact with you, but their spit is actually able to cause tuma as well. And therefore, normally, if you find spit somewhere, if you're walking down the street, and then all of a sudden you're like, oh my gosh, someone spit on me. Okay, keep in mind their culture was probably a little bit different than ours, probably a little more common, but it doesn't matter. Either way, you find spit on you, so you have to assume it's tamei. However, in Yerushalayim, this is based on a rabbinic decree. In Yerushalayim, there is no such decree, and you could assume that people who are spitting, they are already pure. These are people who are in a state of purity, and therefore you could assume that it is that the spit is not tamei, and you don't have to worry about it. However, chutz mishel shuk ha'elyon, except for that's found in the upper marketplace. The upper marketplace there was 2 floors of the marketplace. The upper marketplace was a little less busy, and people were tamei due to sensitivity to other people who are not tamei would go to the less frequented place. They would go to they go off the beaten path, and therefore in the upper marketplace there you do have to be concerned that the spit that you find there is tamei. So bottom line is, Gemara is asking, why did we need an amora to mention that spit found in Yerushalayim is tahar? It's found explicitly in a Mishnah. The Gemara says what the amora is teaching us is that even though it was established that a zav is the person who spits, the zav is the person who's tamei, and if he spits, his saliva is going to be tamei. even if we know that such a person walked through this area, and therefore we could say maybe it came from this person, nonetheless, we will treat it as tar. Kalim, okay, now the Gemara asks the same thing. Kalim, we learned already about utensils. We learned in the Mishnah called Kalim Tzam Yerushalayim, all utensils found in Yerushalayim. If it's on the path leading down to the place of immersion, i.e. the mikvah, Tmeim, they're going to be tamei, right? If you find a utensil on the way, meaning if you ever see, you ever visited a what's it called, a mikvah in these ancient mikvahs, they're basically like a I don't know. They're not a square. Basically, it has like steps going down and steps going up, right? And so one direction was the way going in, and one direction was the way going out. So if you ever like go to like the what is it called? I'm blanking on the name now, but outside, right, not too far from the Kotel, you have that huge excavation site. And anyway, they're in the middle of unearthing like this humongous mikvah that people used on their way directly into the base of English. And basically it's all like steps. So there's steps down. So you find utensils on the way down, then you have to assume it's tummy, because obviously they dropped it on the way, that they're going to be tovelit. Hada alma tar, but you find it elsewhere in Yerushalayim, it is tar. So again, the Gemara is asking, why did the Samora have to come along and tell us that if you find a utensil in Yerushalayim, that you could assume it's tar? I already said so in the Mishnah. Ask the Gemara, wait a second. The end of that Mishnah actually seems to have an opposite inference, because the end of the Mishnah says derech aliyah tahorin, that if it's found the path leading up in the place of immersion from the mikvah, then it's assumed to be tahor. So hada alma tamein. The implication would be that anywhere else in Yerushalayim is presumed to be tamei, right? In other words, you have the first part of the Mishnah which says that if you find a utensil on the way down to the mikvah, it's tamei. Implication: you find a utensil anywhere else in Yerushalayim, it's tahor. And then you have the next part of the Mishnah telling us if you find a utensil on the way up from the mikvah, it's tahor, because you could assume it came from a person who just immersed it. But the implication is anywhere else in Yerushalayim, it's tamei. So the beginning and the end of the Mishnah actually contradict each other. El Reisha Dafka. So what we're going to say is that what the Amora is coming to teach us is how to learn this Mishnah, to teach us that the first part of the Mishnah is the one to be read literally. In other words, or the one to be read most specifically, make the strongest inference. In other words, when the Mishnah says that if you find a utensil on the way down to the mikvah, okay, implication is anywhere else, it is actually tahor. The Seifa lav dafka, okay, the Seifa which says if it's found on the way up, it is tahor. It doesn't mean to exclude anywhere else, but when it comes to exclude one place, la'apuke gazyasa, to exclude, there's like a narrow alleyway which is adjacent to the mikvah. That's also a place where people would put things down before bringing it into the mikvah, and that's where it's coming to exclude. But the bottom line is that Amor is coming to teach us how to read that Mishnah, teach us that kalim, utensils, which we don't know if they're tar found anywhere in Yerushalayim, are going to be treated as tahor. Okay. Ularav to Amar Kigon Sha'avdalo Machat Tmei Meis V'Ikira Babasar. Okay. So Rav said that we're dealing with a case where a person lost a needle who was, which we know was contaminated by a corpse, and then the person recognized that needle. Okay, so basically, remember, we're trying to figure out what's the story of this needle. So we gave one explanation, but earlier we saw Rav who said that we're talking about a case where a person had a needle which he knows came into contact with a corpse, and then that needle got lost, and then this needle looks like that needle. So if that's the case, we're assuming it's that needle, then so we normally have halacha that when a piece of metal, right, the pasuk says b'chalal cherev, a person was killed by a sword, and we discussed this earlier. Why does the Torah talk about a person killed by a sword? A person killed by any means, and they'll still be considered and they still generate tuma. So why is it focused on a person who's killed by a sword? To teach us that the sword is like the corpse, that in as much as the corpse is av hatuma, the highest level of tuma, the metal that comes into contact with the corpse is the highest level of tuma. If that's the case, then person and the utensil should be able to come tummy. In other words, until now we've been assuming that the tumah over here is not the highest level of tumah because it's something which contracted tumah from something else. But now we're saying it's a needle which came into contact with a corpse that makes it the highest level of tumah. That's avatumah. And now there's a doubt. Is this needle? Is it not the needle? But we're going to be machmir, we're going to be strict, and we're going to say it is the needle. If that's the case, and we treat it like an avatuma, then an avatuma, the highest level of tuma, has the ability to make a person tameh and utensils tameh. So why did Rechin Skanakonim tell us that the person and the knife is tahar? To not be the case. So Marvashi Zosomeres, we could infer from here, Azar Shus Harabim, that the courtyard of the Beis Hamikdash is considered a public domain. And therefore, whenever you have a suffix in a public domain, anytime you have a case of davel tuma in a public domain, suffix sveiko tahar, we deem it as tahar. Okay, so what's the source of this? The source of this is actually very interesting, a little hard to wrap our heads around, but we'll try to explain it briefly. And that is the source of of how we deal with tuma, with impurity when there's a doubt, is actually from the sota. The sota is a woman who is warned by her husband not to seclude with another, with a specific man, and she goes ahead and does so. So, and the Gemara and there obviously does so in private, okay, and we assume that she is Tame. Now, Tame is normally not the term that we use for a person who committed adultery. However, the Torah does choose to use the word Tame, and therefore we infer from there all the laws of Tumah. So let's think about that case. That case is a woman who is secluding in private, and there's a suffix if there was quote-unquote Tumah, and we are machmir, we're strict. We say she cannot ever be with her husband again until things get clarified, because there is a suffix, there's a doubt, and maybe she was Tame. We treat it as if she did commit adultery, which again, we're calling Tame. And therefore we learn from there, anytime there's a suffix, Tumah, Bershus HaYachid in private domain, we're going to treat it as Tame. However, if there was no seclusion, if she was talking to this person in public, then she is Tahora. She's going to be pure. And therefore, what we learn from there is suffix Tumah Bershus HaRabim. Anytime there's a doubt of Tumah in a public domain, we're going to be lenient. We're going to say that you are Tahor. So Rav Ashi wants to infer from here the fact that we are not saying that the person. So again, Rav wanted to say the needle is something which is avatoma. In which case we said, wait, so this needle. This needle looks like the same needle that came into contact with a corpse, and therefore that's the needle we're talking about. Okay, so if that's the case, we have a suffix, we have a doubt about this needle, and it came into contact with a person and with a utensil, and yet we're saying the person and utensil are tahar. Why is that? It should be tame, because the needle has the capacity to be metame, to cause tuma to both people and to utensils. So Rav Ashi says it must be that because the azara, the courtyard, is actually considered like a public domain, and whenever you have a suffix of tuma in a public domain, we are lenient. That's why it's lenient. We're tahar over here. Ask Gemara, what would come out is that in this case, then and what would come out is the implication is that in a private domain, if this happened in a private domain, then we would treat it as tamei. Michti, wait a second. We have a concept that for something to become tamei, it has to be something. So this needle is something which does not have the intellect, the ability to be questioned. In other words, the knife, which we're discussing, let's say, you can't ask it questions, right? You can't ask it, what happened over here, right? That's not something you could do. The knife is incapable of answering. Anything which cannot be questioned, whether it's in the private domain or in the public domain, it is tahar, right? What's the source for that? Again, sota. Sota is a person. So the Gemara says, so therefore, the Gemara is saying, wait a second, Rav Ashi, you're trying to tell me, we should make the inference that it's like the public domain, and that's why you're tahar. Even if it's a private domain, since we're talking about a knife, the thing which came into contact with the needle is a knife, and a knife is something which doesn't follow the model of the woman who is a suffix, tahar or tame. Therefore, we default to tahar. So the Gemara says, "Mishum dahavi sfeik tuma haba bidei adam." At the end of the day, it does. Granted, the knife itself is not something which could be asked, but it did come about through the actions of a person, right? Because how did this knife come and touch the needle? Because the kohen, the slaughterer, was the shochet. He was slaughtering it, right? So it came about through a person. So granted, the knife itself cannot be questioned, but the knife was handled by a person in this case, and that's what caused it to potentially become tamei. Any potential tuma which came through a person, we do treat it like it could be inquired about. Even in a case where the object is resting on the ground, it's treated like something that's been the intellect to be questioned if ultimately the tumah was caused by a person causing it to happen. Okay, so Rav Ashi's inference is correct that the azara, the courtyard of the Beis Hamikdash, is treated like a public domain, and that's why in this case, in Rav's reading, where the needle was one which would be an avatuma, we're still going to be treating it. We're going to treat the person and the knife as tahar. Why? Because it's a suffix tuma bershus rabim. It is a potential tuma in a public domain, and the rule is a potential tuma in public domain. We are going to treat it as tahar. Okay, have a wonderful day.